Pretend with me for a moment that I am a late 18th century lady. Actually, now pretend with me that I'm a late 18th century lady. I'm at my grandmother's house digging through some of her old chests and wardrobes and things, and I find myself a cute dress and I go, "Grandma, look at this cute dress I found in your drawers." And she goes, "Ah, yes, you know, that actually used to belong to my great-great-grandmother. You've been wanting a new dress. Why don't you take it, remake it into something cute?" And I go, "Dope." Because that's totally what I would say. And now we have the scenario for today's video. We're going to take this late 16th century Renaissance style dress and remake it into a mid to late-ish 18th century dress. And I feel like this is very fun because it speaks to a proud tradition when it comes to clothes of remaking and reusing them into new things as their old purpose falls out. Either because they became unfashionable, they became too small for their wearer, they were damaged in or soiled in some way that makes them not wearable in their current state. So they get cut up and turned into smaller clothes for younger family members, for children. They get turned into smaller separate items. They get remade into household objects, pillows and things like that. They get remade and reused again and again until they get remade out of existence. That's why we don't have hundreds of thousands of dresses and various older clothes from throughout the centuries, because they get worn out and they get thrown away as like rags and smaller objects, right? I think this is going to be a lot of fun, both in terms of getting into that headspace of this hypothetical historical person, but also as a completely modern costumer, I need to make some 18th century hobbity stuff for this LARP situation. I need several outfits, and I have this old 16th century number that isn't getting a lot of wear these days, and so being able to remake this into some of that is going to save me some time, because like I'm not going to have to redo the hem. I'm going to be able to save that and just remake other bits of it. So I'll save some time, I'll save some money because I'm just reusing old fabric. I don't need to buy new fabric for at least some of these outfit elements, which is great. That said, I don't think I'm gonna get a full several days worth of outfits out head to toe completely on my own. So I did decide to enlist the aid of the sponsor of today's video, ThredUp. I ordered a few different items to help supplement my wardrobe. I got some shirts, a waistcoat, some pants, some cute little mule shoes that individually are very obviously modern items, I think, but I feel like if I style them correctly, I'm gonna get some nice hobbity 18th century vibes that, you know, is perfect for a LARP weekend. ThredUp is an online secondhand shop where you can shop for all the big brands at much less than retail prices. And in fact, all of the outfits that I'm going to be showing today are less than 100 altogether. I'm particularly pleased with my two waistcoat finds. This one's from Reformation. It was originally estimated at 105, but I got it for 23. And this one has the coolest, like, faux quilted stitching going on that reminds me a lot of 18th century jumps. I think it's so neat. These lovely Pendleton wool trousers are my new favorite pants to wear around the house. They're originally estimated at $127, but I got them for $19.94. They feel very comfy, very hobbity. I also got this leather bag by Abel. It has such a cool, very historical feel to it that it ended up being one of the more expensive items on my list at $28.99, originally estimated at $80, but it was too nifty to resist. Whether you're looking for something hobbity inspired or something altogether different, you can shop for hundreds of brands at a fraction of the price, all in one place, and you can use my link down below to shop for my ThredUp favorites and my code to get 50% off your first order plus free shipping. I have a lot of cool stuff in there, you should check it out. I now have a good couple outfits to supplement my LARP weekend adventure later on this summer, but I do still want to make at least a few things, so back to the project of the day. We're going to modernize great-great-great-great-great-grandmother's dress as per the perspective of my fictional character here. First off, I think is going to be separating the skirt from the bodice, and they're going to stay separated. I'm going to make this into a petticoat that is just going to be by itself. It's not going to get reattached back to a bodice of any kind. So that means that I'm going to seam rip the connection point here where this is cartridge pleated into the bodice, and then I'm going to need to rotate it 90 degrees because you can see I have my selvage here at the center front, and I also have another one at the center back, and I want them to be at my sides. So we're just gonna rotate that. I will probably need to re-straighten the top of the skirt because I'm not going to redo the hem. I'm going to leave the hem as it is because that's convenient. And I will just cut the top to whatever I need to make it make sense for my waist. And considering this is probably the lowest point, I'm going to have to, this part will end up being too tall, I'm guessing. We'll find out when I actually get there. So I'll need to trim this off, which will make the whole thing a little bit shorter, but it's already pretty long. I'm not terribly worried about that. In fact, I might actually even cut it a little extra shorter. One, hoppity, cute, do like. But also, I feel like whenever I was wearing this at events, I was constantly doing that thing where I had it like tucked it up so that it was leaving my feet a little bit more free and not in the mud and stuff. So for practical reasons, I think it just makes sense to go shorter. I also think that that gives me a bit of material that I can then potentially use in the bodice, because the bodice is too small. It might not look terribly small from this point of view, but there's definitely some room that we could add some pieces in back here. I have a lot of small changes I want to make to the bodice. I'm going to get rid of these little fun shoulder floofs because they're not really the style of the time, and that is actually going to also give me some fabric to play with. I'm going to insert it either here or I might go inside seam. I'm not 100% sure yet. Hello, Future Morgan here, reporting in to say that I do know 100% of what happens, so we're gonna skip all of this rambling guesswork that I'm going through and move on to what actually happens. First though, we're gonna move on back to the skirt. You saw how I used the chalk mark to mark the new waistline right and then put pins over the chalk marks? Now I'm going to flip it over and compare the pins from the first side with the chalk marks on the other side. This lets me get a good average line to cut off of, and now this leftover bit here is going to get very delicately set aside for the bodice later. Starting at the center front of the petticoat, I make knife pleats a little bit over an inch wide and then promptly redo them when I realize that that makes the waist a little bit too big. So I pleat it again, then pleat the other side to match, and double check that my overall measurement here is approximately half my waist plus a couple of inches for overlap. For the back half, I'm in the mood to change things up a little bit, so I'm gonna do little tiny even gathers, which takes a lot longer to do than the pleats, but it will give more body to the back of the skirt, and it's just what I'm in the mood to do. I made 3 rows of stitches, doing my best to line them up with each other so that when I went to pull those gathering threads, they all fall into really nice, even, regular folds. I got it to the same width as the front part of the waistband and then tied those gathering threads into a knot to keep it at that size, and then stitched on what is probably a very strange linen braid choice to use as a waistband for this, but it's what I had handy and it seems to be holding up all right so far. If it ends up showing lots of signs of undue wear and tear later on, then I'll just replace it when the time comes. For now though, I have a finished skirt slash petticoat. On to the bodice. I will admit I was kind of envisioning a pretty low-key adjustment for this bodice, maybe adding a couple of inches to the side back seams, of course, maybe rearranging one of the lines of trim if they really had to, but the more I looked at it and compared it to the pictures of the extant jackets and bodices and artwork of the period, I realized it needed a bit more of an extensive overhaul. The striped double layer of canvas that served as the foundation layer for this bodice was a really great way to hold the boning and provide a super sturdy structure for the garment so that it could do all that good work of supporting me, but I just made a pair of stays, so we might as well go the jacket route. They tend to be a little softer, lightly boned if at all. Because the stays are doing all that work of shaping the body, the jacket only needs to be big enough to fit over the stays and to hold the sleeves up. Once I had all that trim and the original foundation removed, I was left with the green wool bodice shape here, which has a surprisingly decent amount of seam allowance left in at the sides and at the front, and even a little bit at the shoulder seams, which I apparently altered at some point to be a little bit smaller, but didn't trim down the excess out of, which is actually great for me right now because it means we have a little bit of extra to let out. My lacing gap earlier on seemed to be around 2 inches wide on each side, so I'm cutting a pair of 3-inch strips to put into that side back seam. I only have them pinned for now, just in case I need to make adjustments, but after trying it on, we pretty much do have the width we need around the waist and bust. The shoulder straps are set in a little bit wide at the back of the shoulder, so we're going to need to cut those off where it meets at the back and then set them in a little bit closer to each other. I also definitely want to reclaim this shoulder seam allowance, so I'm going to take that out and restitch it with smaller seam allowances. That should give the back just enough slack to sit a little bit lower. The back edge is still sitting maybe a bit higher than I'd like, but this is where the skirting is going to get attached to it anyway, so you won't be able to see any of the gaps between the bodice and the skirt once it's done, so I'm going to leave it as is. I'm satisfied enough with the fit at this point that I think I am safe to go ahead and cut a new lining. A little bit of cleanup on these ragged edges and one tiny last adjustment to the back here. I decided I wanted it to be a little bit higher and the straps to be ever so slightly closer again, so I popped a scrap on and trimmed away the excess to make it all tidy and even. For the lining, I thought about trying to reuse that striped canvas from earlier, but it's just too much for this. It's too heavy and too thick, so instead I grabbed a scrap of thin white linen that I have, and it'll add just the tiniest bit of structure to the bodice, but very minimal bulk. Once I had the linings all roughly prepared for all my pieces, which did also include some pin basting to keep all my layers together so they don't move around until I'm ready, I started turning in the raw edges towards the inside. I'll admit, I barely know more than Claire the cat here does about 18th century sewing, and particularly when it comes to order of operations, but I did my best based on looking at extant jackets online, as well as some helpful books on the subject. All 3 of these were very, very helpful throughout this. Highly recommend. That said, if you see me doing something silly, it's probably not their fault. It's probably me just not quite fully understanding the proper way to go about this stuff. I say this because it's definitely a little bit of a jigsaw puzzle trying to figure out which seams and edges you need to sew together and in what order. The way I ended up doing it was sewing the center front and the bottom edges first so that they are tidy and done. And then for the side seams, I went for an English stitch, which I have recently found to be very lovely and tidy and very strong for sewing 2-layer seams together. I hope you guys are ready for the absolutely most absurd and rough method of getting a sleeve pattern that I've ever done. This felt like both a terrible idea and yet also seemingly the best way to go about doing with what I had in my head at the time, so bear with me. I made a slightly conical tube about the size of my arm and then trimmed away at the top of the sleeve in pieces, little chunks, until it felt like the sleeve head was kind of going in at the right angle of the bodice, as well as covering all of the deep arm size towards the back. I nipped in a little bit for the inside of the elbow at that point and then cut my tube open so we could lay it flat. This gives me the absolute roughest version of what the bare minimum size I need for my sleeve to be. The actual sleeve should be a little bit looser for ease than my paper tube was, so I did a bit of slash and spread to kind of part the sleeve and give it a bit more ease. Remember that bit of fabric I ever so delicately set aside earlier? Now we get to take that back out so that those narrow strips can be stitched together to make wider bits of fabric. It's not quite enough for our sleeve, but it's really close. I can just cut off some of the excess corner on one side and then pop it over onto the other side where I need it. Now my fabric is big enough for the pattern. I got those cut out and stitched. The sleeve fit is okay, maybe a little tight in the elbow though, so I cut away some of the stitching to handle it for now, and I'll figure out what I want to do about that a little bit later. For now, we need to get the sleeve onto the bodice. I'm not sure how to explain this particular feat of witchcraft. I just sort of kept poking the sleeve into place until it felt like it was the right place. And then I started pinning. I pinned underneath the arms first, and then for the top of the sleeve, there's kind of this extra flap of green fabric that gets folded up out of the way so that the sleeve can get pinned to the lining like you see here, and any excess fabric left over at this point gets pleated right in the upper back of the arm. Repeat that on the other arm. I generally like to always try on new garments with both sleeves in place because it makes such a big difference on fit, particularly with how it is over the shoulders. Sometimes if you have just one sleeve, it'll inordinately pull the shoulder on one side versus the other. So both sleeves, we need to get them in place. It is time to take it off of the dress form and put it on the me form. Things honestly fit a lot better than they should at this point. I have lots of range of motion. The sleeves look pretty dang good, especially from the front if you ask me. The back seemed a little bit wrinkly to me, like there was maybe excess material kind of right here at the lower back of the arm. Currently though, I can pull my arm quite a bit forward across my body in the sleeve, so I have this really great range of motion. I debated taking out some of that sleeve fabric, which would mean I wouldn't be able to move my arm quite as far, but I wasn't sure if it would be worth it. So in the end, I decided to leave it. I think it's okay if we exchange super immaculate fit for increased range of motion. The slit in my sleeves ended up being pretty much right in front of my arm, or right at the inside of my elbow, which is not where I think it was laying earlier, but honestly, this is a great result. This is a good spot for this. So I could just leave it as is, kind of a cute little cut split sleeve situation, but I think I'm gonna add a little triangle right here to kind of fill in the space. The center front point is pretty decent. It could be lower, but it is serviceable. In an ideal world, the back would also be pointed to match, but I've decided I'm not gonna bother. There aren't that many extents with flat, non-pointed backs, but there's some, so I'm gonna take my wins where I can get them. Back to that long strip of fabric, I cut off the top of the skirt. The first half of it went to make the sleeves, and now the second half is going to get pleated up and turned into a little mini skirt at the back of the jacket. There's lots of these, all the way from basically full over gowns to little bitty ruffles just at the very back. And so I have lots of options on where I can start my skirts, but I think I like this the best, around 4 or so inches from the front. Before I stitch that on though, I should actually finish up all those seams on the bodice, which mostly just involves a lot of flipping 2 fabric edges in towards each other on the inside and then whip stitching that folded edge. For the shoulder strap, it's a little different. That's gonna get folded and then sort of placed on top right where I have the pins at, and then I'm gonna stitch that down through all the layers. And then for the front of the sleeve, repeat the same thing. The shoulder strap just gets folded down over the raw edges, stitched in place. The tops of the sleeves, the arm side, are already pinned precisely where they need to be, so I'm going to stitch through all of my layers here to finish off the arm side. And then for the bottom of the sleeves, I did cut a pair of little triangles, and those are going to help fill in that gap I mentioned earlier and make it just the right size to fit my arm, I hope. After a lovely evening on the couch in front of the TV, I had all those seams stitched and everything looking nice and tidy. I did end up changing the pleats at the back of the shoulders to gathers. I don't know, I think that pleats are maybe a bit more typical of the period, but I felt the vibes in the universe telling me to go for gathers. I don't know what to say more than that. For the linen on the inside of the arm side, I folded down the raw edge once and then kind of prick stitched it to the wool seam allowance on the inside, which I left raw, the wool part, because it's not really something I'm worried about fraying. And I've seen some other extant armholes where they left raw cut edges, so this feels in line with the style. Back to the skirting, I marked the center front with a pin and then did some quick test pleats to get an idea of my sizing. Regular 3-to-1 knife pleats ended up working out perfectly to be the length I needed though. So I took out those temporary pins and then ironed back all my seam allowances with just one fold to keep the bulk down to a minimum. I thought about lining it in the same white linen scraps that I did for the bodice, but I remembered that the previously set aside bias tape existed and figured that that would make a really nice and very minimal facing for the interior. It's very light. None of the bias tape was quite long enough all by itself, but pieced together, it was plenty to get the whole skirt done. I repleated it the same as before and tried something that is a little bit new to me, but I was curious if it would work. So Effectively, what I did is English stitching the skirt onto the bodice. I went back and forth, dropping whatever the most recent layer I had stitched through each time. So coming towards me, I went through the 4 wool layers, and then on the return stitch back, I did just the innermost wool layers and the linen lining. Only time is going to tell, I suppose, if this will hold up, but my preliminary findings are that it seems to be working really, really well. You can't see any of the thread stitching. It seems really good and strong, and it lets that skirt kind of spring out nicely. I think this is going to work. I am so excited about this because I think I've made a number of outfits before. That's nothing new and exciting. And I've even made items that are like technically separate pieces, some sort of top and skirt that coordinate, are meant to go with each other and are in effect meant to create one complete dress. But I've not made a whole lot of things that are optionally separates or coordinates. With this project, I can absolutely wear the top and the skirt together and they look lovely and cohesive, and it's 100% an option to wear them completely separately, and that is weirdly kind of blowing my mind. It's a type of flexibility that I'm really excited to play with though. A big part of the fun of making this project was the creative limitations it had. Since I was working with this decades old project of mine, I was really forced to work around the existing fabric shapes and update the style as best as I could to the new time period, and it really also gave me permission to just get on with it, since it didn't make sense to sit here and make a bunch of mock-ups trying to aim for a certain level of perfection. Instead, I could really just dive in with the actual fabric and see what I could make happen. I think it's going to add beautifully to my Hobbit wardrobe for the event later this summer, and while it's not exactly perfectly 18th century, it's pretty good. You know, pop on the right accessories and I think that'll help sell the look. I'm very, very pleased with how this turned out, and I'm really looking forward to seeing what else I can make and mix and match and like coordinate with, right? That's part of what was really fun about the ThredUp stuff, is I tried to get things specifically that would blend well all together. And by the way, of course, if you haven't already, you should check out my link down below with ThredUp to get that 50% off your first order plus free shipping. Put in my code, check it out, make cool separates, and have a wonderful, wonderful day.